He did not flinch when their eyes met. He did not lower his gaze, even as the wind carved pain into his cheeks. In that instant, something ancient paused between them, as if the ice itself had been listening. The man had arrived at the edge of the frozen inlet with no plan left that still worked. His boots were split at the seams, the leather stiff as bone, and each step cracked the surface snow with a sound like thin glass breaking underfoot. Breath burned his lungs, not with panic, but with the steady exhaustion of someone who had already spent all the fear he had. The Arctic did not feel hostile to him anymore. It felt indifferent, which was worse and also honest. Above him, the sky was a hard, pale blue, so clear it almost hurt to look at, and the light reflected off the ice in a way that made distance impossible to judge. He had been walking for hours, maybe longer, carrying a body that refused to forget grief even when the cold tried to erase everything else. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. She watched him long before he noticed her. From the low ridge of packed snow near the shoreline, the Inuit Huntress stood still enough to be mistaken for part of the land itself. Her parka was worn, stitched and restitched, shaped by years of movement rather than fashion, and the fur at her hood was rimed with frost that clung to it like a second skin. She had learned early that survival depended on seeing without being seen, on letting the world reveal itself through patience. Men who stumbled into this territory usually announced themselves with noise, panic, or the arrogance of believing the land would bend. This one did none of those things. He moved slowly, conserving strength, eyes scanning not for threats, but for meaning. As if he were listening for instructions, the ice had not yet decided to give. The wind shifted, carrying his scent toward her, metal, old smoke, and something human underneath that spoke of loss rather than hunger. She adjusted her grip on the hunting spear, not raising it, not lowering it, simply acknowledging that balance was a choice renewed every second out here. The snow creaked softly beneath her boots as she stepped forward just enough to be visible. When he finally saw her, he stopped. Not abruptly, not in shock, but with the careful stillness of someone who understands that sudden movement is an insult in a place that demands respect. Their eyes met across a stretch of ice marked with old cracks, and she noticed immediately what others often missed. There was no challenge in his gaze and no plea either. He thought of the last warm room he had been in, months ago, where wood had popped softly in a stove and the air smelled faintly of oil and bread. That memory surfaced not as comfort, but as evidence of a life he no longer trusted himself to return to. He had left after the accident without saying goodbye to the version of himself that existed before it. Since then, everything had been forward motion or collapse. Standing there now, facing a woman who looked carved from endurance, he felt something unfamiliar, permission to stop pretending he knew what came next. His shoulders dropped a fraction, and the tension he had been carrying like a second spine loosened, just enough to breathe. She studied his face the way she studied weather. The faint frost collecting on his lashes told her how long he had been exposed. The set of his jaw told her how much pain he could hold without turning it outward. She had seen men break in quieter ways than screaming, had watched them hollow themselves out until there was nothing left for the cold to take. This one still had something intact, something stubborn and bruised but unashamed. It unsettled her more than fear ever could. The ice groaned somewhere beneath them, a low, distant sound like the earth clearing its throat, reminding both of them that stillness was temporary. When she spoke, it was not loud. The wind carried her words away from her mouth and then back again, circling them as if testing their weight. She did not ask him why he was there. The land had already answered that question. Instead, she asked where he thought he was going and whether he understood how little the Arctic cared about intentions. His reply came slowly, shaped with care, not to impress, but to be accurate. He said he did not know where he was going anymore, only that he could not stay where he had been. He said he would listen if the land or its people had something to tell him. That was when she stepped closer, closing the distance with the calm decisiveness of someone who knew exactly how much space to take. Up close, he could see the lines at the corners of her eyes, not from age, but from squinting into wind and light, from choosing awareness over comfort again and again. Her presence did not warm the air, but it changed it, giving shape to the silence between them. He did not reach for her, did not retreat. He simply met her eyes without fear, and in that moment she felt something shift, an instinct older than caution, sharper than curiosity. The words left her mouth before she fully examined them, carried on breath that fogged instantly in the cold. They were not an invitation born of softness, nor a test meant to dominate. They were a declaration of immediacy in a place where tomorrow was never guaranteed. She leaned in just enough for him to hear it clearly over the wind, over the ice, over the echo of his own heartbeat. "Kiss me right now," she whispered, not as a command, but as a truth she had decided to honor. He did not move. Not yet. The Arctic held its breath with him, and the story of what would bind them or break them waited in the narrow space between restraint and surrender. He did not answer her immediately, and the delay was not hesitation, but reverence. Out here, every action carried weight, and he had learned the hard way what happened when moments were rushed. The cold pressed in around them, patient and absolute, as if daring him to misunderstand what was being offered. He stood close enough now to feel the heat of her body through layers of fur and fabric, a quiet defiance against the temperature that tried to claim everything alive. Her breath moved the fine frost on his scarf, melting it into darkened threads, and that small, intimate detail grounded him more than any promise of shelter could have. He had not been touched with intention since before the loss, since before his name felt like something borrowed from someone else. The Arctic had stripped him of excuses, and here, in front of a woman who asked for nothing except presence, he felt the risk of feeling again rise sharply in his chest. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. She did not repeat herself. Inuit elders had taught her that words wasted were strength wasted, and she trusted silence to do the work most people demanded of language. Her eyes never left his, dark and steady, reflecting not submission or impatience, but a calm acceptance of whatever choice he would make. This was not about comfort or romance as outsiders imagined it. It was about acknowledging life while it was still warm in the body, about recognizing connection as a survival skill no less vital than fire or food. She had lost people to the ice, to storms that arrived without warning, to grief that hollowed them until they forgot how to stay. She had learned that waiting for certainty was another way of inviting death. He thought of the night he had failed to act. The moment burned into him like frostbite memory that never quite healed. He had waited then, telling himself he needed to be sure, telling himself there would be time. There hadn't been. That lesson had followed him north, echoing in every step, every mile of ice and snow. Looking at her now, he understood that this moment was asking something different of him. Not courage as bravado, but courage as honesty. To step forward without guarantees. To accept warmth without demanding permanence. Slowly, deliberately, he removed one glove, the motion stiff and careful as blood rushed painfully back into his fingers. The exposed skin burned in the cold, but he welcomed the sensation. It reminded him that he was still capable of feeling pain without breaking. He lifted his hand, not touching her face yet, letting her see the intention before the action. This was how respect was shown here, by making space for consent not as a word, but as a shared understanding. Her gaze softened almost imperceptibly, not in triumph, but in recognition. When his fingers finally brushed her cheek, it was with a gentleness that surprised even him. Her skin was cold from the wind, but alive, solid, real. The contact sent a quiet shock through his body, not electric but grounding, as if he had found something stable to hold on to after months of drifting. She did not lean into his touch, nor did she pull away. She met him exactly where he was, matching pressure, matching breath. The world narrowed to that point of contact, the sound of the wind fading into a distant hum. She closed the remaining space between them, not hurried, not dramatic. Her forehead touched his briefly, a gesture older than words, one used to share warmth and intention at the same time. He could smell the faint trace of smoke in her clothes, the kind that came from seal oil lamps and long nights inside wooden shelters. It reminded him of endurance, of communities built on mutual reliance rather than isolation. His lips hovered near hers, close enough to feel the heat of her breath, and for the first time in a long while, his chest loosened instead of tightening. The kiss, when it came, was not consuming. It was measured, steady, as if they were testing the integrity of ice before crossing. Her mouth was firm, sure, carrying no illusion about what this moment could or could not become. His response was equally restrained, shaped by the knowledge that tenderness could be a form of strength. The cold bit harder at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. Something inside him, long frozen, shifted and cracked, letting warmth seep into places he had sealed off for survival. When they parted, the silence returned, heavier now with meaning. She studied his face again, noting the subtle change in his eyes, the way grief had loosened its grip just enough to allow something else through. She did not smile. Instead, she nodded once, as if acknowledging an agreement neither of them needed to explain. There would be consequences to this connection. Everything here had consequences, but she sensed that he understood that too. That understanding mattered more than any promise. The ice groaned again beneath their feet, louder this time, a reminder that stillness was never permanent. She turned slightly toward the inland path, the one that led away from open water and toward shelter, toward stories told by firelight and the slow work of trust. She did not tell him to follow. She simply began to walk, confident that he would choose his direction with care. Behind her, he hesitated only long enough to pull his glove back on, sealing warmth where he could. Then he took his first step after her, aware that whatever waited ahead would demand more than endurance alone. The first thing he learned was that following her did not mean being led. She did not guide him like a rescued man, and he did not walk like a captive. They moved as two people sharing a landscape that demanded humility from both. They traveled inland where the wind changed character, losing the sharp, open water fury and becoming a steady pressure that seemed to search for weak seams in clothing and resolve. The snow here was deeper, less scoured by constant gusts, and it swallowed sound until even his breathing felt too loud. Her pace was deliberate, fast enough to keep blood moving, slow enough to read the terrain with every step. He noticed how she placed her feet where the surface looked ordinary but was safer beneath, how she never walked in straight lines unless the land allowed it, and how her attention moved constantly from horizon to ground to sky like a practiced rhythm. He had been alone long enough that he'd started mistaking stubbornness for strength. Walking behind her, he began to understand that true strength looked like awareness, not bravado. She spoke rarely, but not because she was cold inside. She spoke the way hunters do when words must earn their place. When she did speak, it was to name what he could not yet see. A thin drift that hid a hollow, a darker line in the snow that suggested old ice beneath, a cluster of rocks that would break the wind if they had to stop. He tried not to stare at her, but he watched anyway, because watching was how he learned, and learning was how he survived. Every once in a while she looked back, catching his attention without accusation, as if reminding him that being observed was part of this new agreement. He responded by meeting her eyes with the same steady calm he had offered on the shoreline, and each time her gaze held a fraction longer, testing whether his composure was real. Hours passed in a kind of disciplined silence that felt more intimate than conversation. His body began to ache in layers, muscles, joints, then something deeper, a fatigue that reached into the mind and tempted it with surrender. He had been living on minimal food, rationing not only calories but hope, and now the effort of matching her competence made him aware of everything he lacked. Still, he kept pace. Not to impress her, but because he refused to become another burden the Arctic could easily claim. The cold found its way into the small gaps between glove and sleeve, between scarf and jaw, and he learned to correct those gaps quickly, the way she did, without drama. Eventually, the land gave them a shallow valley where the wind softened, and he saw what he had been too disoriented to look for earlier, signs of human intention hidden in plain sight. A line of snow that was not wind-made, a subtle pattern of packed ground, a low structure half-buried, built to disappear. It was not a village in the way outsiders imagined, not a display of permanence, but a shelter designed to work with the landscape rather than against it. She approached it without ceremony, checking the perimeter with her eyes first, listening to the silence as if it could answer questions. He felt his chest tighten with the unfamiliar sensation of arriving somewhere that did not feel like an accident. Inside, warmth was not immediate comfort, but earned heat, stored in wood, preserved in careful insulation, protected from the wind by intelligent design. The air smelled of smoke and dried hide, and something faintly sweet he couldn't name. His eyelashes thawed slowly, dripping cold water that traced his cheeks like accidental tears. The room was dim, lit by a small flame that made the shadows move gently across the walls. She removed her gloves first, then her hood, revealing dark hair braided tight, practical and quiet. She did not tell him to sit. She placed a kettle near the flame and began to work with the calm efficiency of someone who knew that survival was made of small, repeated actions done without complaint. He stood awkwardly for a moment, uncertain where he belonged in this space. In his old life, hospitality had been performed with words and smiles. Here, it was performed with function. When she handed him a cup, it was not offered with softness, but with certainty, as if she had already decided he would live long enough to drink it. The liquid was hot and sharp, tasting of herbs and smoke, and it burned his mouth in a way that felt almost cleansing. Heat spread through his throat and down into his chest, loosening the tight knot of cold that had been sitting there like a stone. He exhaled slowly, eyes closing for a brief second, and when he opened them again, she was watching him with the same careful attention she gave the weather. He realized then that she was not only assessing whether he was safe, she was assessing whether he was honest. The Arctic punished lies quickly. A man who overestimated his strength died. A man who pretended he was fine collapsed without warning. She seemed to read his body as a map of what he refused to say. He could feel the instinct to hide rise in him, old habits from a life where vulnerability was used against people, but the warmth in his hands made it harder to cling to that armor. He swallowed, and in the quiet between the kettle's faint sounds and the wind outside, he said a few words about himself. Not a full story, not a confession, but an offering. That he had come north after something he could not undo, that he had been searching for silence and instead found a place that forced him to listen. She did not ask for details. That restraint startled him more than interrogation would have. Instead, she spoke about the land as if it were a teacher, how it demanded truth, how it did not tolerate arrogance, how it rewarded preparation. She spoke about ice the way some people speak about family, with respect and familiarity, aware of its moods and dangers. She did not describe herself as mystical or magical, but he could tell she carried knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that was both practical and cultural, rooted in the understanding that survival was communal even when you were physically alone. He listened, not because he wanted to romanticize her, but because her worldview made his own loneliness feel less like destiny and more like a choice. Later, when the immediate threat of freezing had passed, the deeper discomfort arrived, the discomfort of being seen. She moved around the shelter, preparing food, checking tools, tending the small flame, and every action suggested competence that did not need approval. He felt shame rise unexpectedly, not about weakness, but about how much of his life had been spent chasing validation from people who never cared whether he truly lived. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cup, and he hated that she might notice. Of course she noticed. She said nothing, but she set a piece of food near him, dense and nourishing, and he understood the message. Eat, because living is the first requirement of healing. When he finally spoke again, the words came heavier, shaped by the heat thawing his defenses. He told her there had been a night with bad visibility, a road slick with ice, a moment where he had looked away for a second. He did not say the victim's name, not yet, but the way his voice tightened made the absence louder than any detail. He told her he had survived, and that survival had felt like a sentence. He told her he had been trying to punish himself with distance, thinking the Arctic would either erase him or judge him. Saying it out loud made him feel exposed, but also strangely lighter, as if the truth took up less space than the lies he'd been carrying. She listened without flinching, not because she lacked empathy, but because she did not fear the ugliness of human pain. When he finished, she did not absolve him. She did not condemn him. Instead, she said something that felt both harsh and kind, that grief did not grant him ownership over suffering, and that remorse without responsibility was another form of running. She told him the land would not decide his worth. That was his work. The words landed in him like cold water and then like warmth, leaving him unsettled in a way that felt necessary. That night, sleep did not come easily. The shelter creaked softly as the wind shifted, and the flame's small movements painted the room with restless shadows. He lay on a rough bedroll, listening to her breathing across the space. Steady, controlled, the breath of someone who had learned to rest without fully letting go. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the memory of her kiss like a quiet ember, not demanding, not fading. It was not a promise of love. It was a sign that he was still capable of connection, even with a past that threatened to poison everything it touched. Near dawn, he heard movement outside, footsteps crunching snow with a rhythm that didn't belong to her. He sat up, heart tightening, instinctively reaching for his boots. She was already awake, already listening, her posture shifting into alert readiness without panic. Through a narrow opening, he saw shapes moving in the pale morning light, figures approaching with deliberate calm, not sneaking, not rushing. The way they came suggested community, not attack, but his body didn't know how to trust that yet. He looked at her, and for the first time since meeting her, he saw something like caution in her eyes, not fear, but awareness of what this meeting could demand from both of them. The door covering lifted, and cold air flooded in like a blade. Several members of her clan stood outside, their faces partially covered, eyes sharp with curiosity and assessment. They looked past her and saw him, a stranger in their shelter, a man with a hollowed gaze and unfamiliar scent. The oldest among them spoke first, voice low and steady, asking her a question in their language. She answered without hesitation, but her hand briefly touched the edge of his sleeve, small, grounding, a gesture that said, "Stay calm, stay honest, stay present." He swallowed, realizing that surviving the ice had been the easy part. Now he had to survive being known. The elders did not enter all at once. They waited at the threshold, letting the shelter decide how much of them it would accept. Respect here was measured in restraint. The oldest woman stood slightly forward, her posture bent not by weakness, but by time lived attentively. Frost clung to the edges of her lashes the way it had to the Huntresses, and her gaze moved slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail of the scene before settling on him. He felt the weight of that look more sharply than the cold he had escaped. This was not the inspection of an intruder alone, but of a story that had arrived unannounced and now demanded acknowledgement. He lowered his eyes briefly, not in submission, but in recognition that some forms of authority were earned through endurance rather than force. The Huntress spoke calmly, explaining his arrival without embellishment. She did not protect him with half-truths, nor did she expose him for approval. She said he had walked out of the ice without arrogance, that he had listened, that he had accepted warmth without assuming ownership of it. In their language, the words for listening and surviving shared a common root, and he felt the truth of that settle into him as she spoke. The elders listened without interruption, the way people do when they understand that meaning arrives between sentences as much as within them. When it was his turn, no one prompted him. Silence opened like a door and waited. He stood slowly, joints stiff, body still learning how to exist in heat again. He spoke carefully, not translating his life into excuses, not trying to make his pain impressive. He said he had caused harm through inattention, that he carried responsibility he could not shed, and that he had come north believing isolation would be a fair punishment. He admitted that he had been wrong, that the land had not erased his guilt, only clarified it. The words felt raw in his mouth, but once spoken, they no longer thrashed inside him like trapped animals. The eldest woman studied him for a long moment after he finished. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a soft groan through the ice beneath the shelter, as if the world itself were responding. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady and unadorned. She said that remorse was not rare, but endurance of it was. That some people carried guilt like a badge, while others carried it like work. She asked him which kind he intended to be. The question was not rhetorical. It was practical, the way survival questions always were here. He answered without theatrics. He said he did not know yet how to carry it properly, but that he was willing to learn how not to make it anyone else's burden. He said he did not ask to belong, only to remain long enough to do something useful instead of disappearing. The Huntress watched him from the side, her expression unreadable, but something in her posture eased, as if tension she had been holding since dawn had found a place to rest. The elders exchanged brief glances, communication that required no words, and the oldest woman nodded once, the motion small but decisive. They allowed him to stay, with conditions that were spoken plainly. He would work, he would listen, he would not confuse acceptance with forgiveness. These were not punishments, but structures, boundaries designed to keep everyone alive. He agreed without bargaining. The simplicity of the agreement felt almost shocking after a life filled with contracts that hid more than they revealed. When the elders left, their departure was as quiet as their arrival, leaving behind a shelter that felt subtly altered, as if the air itself had acknowledged a shift. The days that followed taught him how fragile humility could be. He worked alongside the Huntress and others from the clan, learning tasks that demanded precision rather than strength, cutting, repairing, hauling, watching. He learned how quickly arrogance could kill in small ways, by wasting energy, by misreading weather, by assuming yesterday's conditions would repeat themselves. Mistakes were corrected without cruelty, but without softness either. Here, survival was communal, and failure was addressed before it could spread. He found a strange comfort in that clarity. With the Huntress, silence continued to do most of the work. They moved together with growing familiarity, passing tools, sharing glances that carried instruction or warning. Physical closeness became ordinary without becoming casual. At night, when they sat near the flame, the memory of that first kiss hovered between them, not as unresolved tension, but as a shared reference point, a reminder of how abruptly honesty had entered their lives. He did not reach for her again without invitation. She noticed. Respect, she knew, was not proven once, but practiced continuously. One evening, after a day that left his muscles trembling with fatigue, They sat outside, watching the sky bruise itself with approaching weather. The cold had sharpened again, biting through layers, and the ice shifted restlessly beneath the surface, making low, distant sounds like breath drawn too deep. She spoke then about her own losses, not in detail, but in outline. A brother taken by thin ice, an aunt who chose the sea during a winter of too many funerals. She did not frame these stories as tragedies alone, but as parts of a lineage that understood survival as a collective memory. Listening, he felt his own grief change shape, less isolated, less singular. He told her later the name he had avoided. Saying it aloud hurt in a way he could not soften, but she did not look away. She placed her hand briefly over his, grounding rather than comforting, and said that carrying a name was heavier than carrying a shadow, but also more honest. The warmth of that contact spread slowly, not erasing pain, but allowing it to exist without consuming everything else. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and persistent, reshaping the land with quiet determination. That night, sleep came differently. Not easily, but deeply. He dreamed of walking on ice that held under his weight, of hearing his name spoken without accusation. When he woke before dawn, the shelter was quiet, the flame low. The Huntress stood near the entrance, looking out into the pale light, her silhouette steady against the shifting world. He joined her without speaking. They stood side by side, not touching, sharing the cold as something faced together rather than endured alone. The storm arrived by afternoon, fierce and sudden, swallowing distance and sound. Work ceased, movement restricted. Inside the shelter, the world narrowed again to breath, heat, and proximity. The storm pressed against the walls like a test, and he felt old instincts rise. Panic. The urge to flee. The belief that disaster always followed stillness. He forced himself to stay, to trust the structures around him. Across the space, the Huntress met his eyes, calm and present, and he realized that this too was part of the work, learning when not to run. As the wind howled, she moved closer, not for warmth alone, but for steadiness. Their shoulders touched, a simple contact that carried the weight of days lived honestly. He felt the urge to speak, to explain himself again, but he resisted. Some truths did not need repetition. Outside, the storm tore at the land, indifferent and immense. Inside, something quieter took shape, an understanding forged not by romance, but by shared endurance. He wondered then what would be asked of him next, what cost would come with staying. He knew enough now to understand that belonging was not a gift, but a responsibility, one that would demand more than survival. As the storm raged on, he felt both the fear of that demand and the unexpected certainty that he was no longer alone in facing it. The storm did not end with drama. It loosened its grip slowly, like a hand releasing something it had tested and decided not to keep. When silence returned, it carried weight instead of relief. Morning came pale and restrained, the light diffused through cloud cover so thick it erased shadows. The world outside looked altered but intact, reshaped rather than destroyed, and that distinction mattered here. He stepped out with the others to assess what the storm had taken and what it had spared, learning to read damage without panic. A drift collapsed here, a path erased there, but the shelters held, the supplies endured, and the land offered no signs of anger, only consequence. He worked without being told, his movements slower now but surer, guided by observation instead of instinct alone. The elders watched without commentary. Approval, he was learning, was rarely announced. As the day unfolded, something subtle changed in how people addressed him. Not warmth, not trust, but inclusion in the rhythm of necessary tasks. Someone handed him a tool without explanation. Another waited for him to finish before continuing their own work. These were small gestures, but in a place where survival depended on precision, they carried significance. He did not mistake them for forgiveness. He understood them as acknowledgement of effort sustained beyond crisis. That felt heavier and more meaningful than kindness alone. The Huntress moved through the day with her usual quiet authority, but he noticed the difference now. She no longer kept a measured distance between them. Not closeness, exactly, but an absence of deliberate space. When they worked side by side, their movements aligned naturally like parts of a system learning to anticipate one another. At one point, she corrected his grip on a tool with a brief touch to his wrist. Efficient, unceremonious, and the contact grounded him more deeply than the kiss had days before. It said, "You are here, and you are expected to be present." Later, when the work paused and the cold settled back into its steady, familiar pressure, they walked together toward a ridge overlooking the frozen inlet. The ice stretched outward, scarred by cracks and ridges that caught the light like old wounds. He recognized the place where they had first stood facing one another, where he had arrived empty-handed and uncertain whether he deserved to continue. Standing there now, he felt the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming, not erased, but navigable. The land had not absolved him. It had given him structure. She stopped near the edge, planting her feet with practiced certainty, and looked out over the ice as if consulting an old companion. When she spoke, her voice was low, almost conversational, shaped by wind rather than urgency. She said that people often came north believing the land would judge them. In truth, it only revealed what they carried. She said that staying meant accepting that revelation every day, without theatrics, without escape. He listened, feeling the truth of it settle into him like cold that no longer surprised. He told her then that he would leave when asked, and stay only as long as his presence did not harm the balance they protected. The words were not a vow of devotion, nor a plea for acceptance. They were an offering of boundaries. She turned to him, studying his face with the same careful attention she had given him on the first day, and for the first time, something like approval crossed her features. Not softened, but clear. She said that knowing when to leave was part of knowing how to stay. The paradox did not confuse him. It steadied him. The kiss that followed was different from the first. There was no urgency in it, no test. It came after silence, after shared labor, after honesty that had survived daylight. It was brief, firm, grounded, and when they parted, neither of them lingered as if afraid it would disappear. Connection here was not clung to. It was returned to, when appropriate, like warmth from a well-tended fire. He felt no need to name what they were becoming. The absence of labels felt like respect. In the days that followed, routine replaced intensity. He learned more, failed less, and accepted correction without defensiveness. At night, when stories were shared, he listened more than he spoke, absorbing histories shaped by endurance rather than conquest. When he did speak, he chose his words carefully, aware now that language carried responsibility. His grief did not vanish. It became something he worked around, something integrated into his decisions instead of steering them. Responsibility, he realized, was not about punishment. It was about presence. One evening, as the light stretched long and thin across the ice, the eldest woman approached him. Her voice was steady, unadorned, as always. She said that staying through a storm proved endurance, but staying after proved intention. She told him he would be allowed to remain through the next season, to continue learning, contributing, listening. There was no ceremony attached to the decision. It was delivered as information, not reward. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the weight of what had been offered without pretending it was more than it was. That night, he stood outside alone for a moment, the cold pressing in with familiar insistence. He looked up at the sky, clear now, stars sharp and innumerable, and felt something unfamiliar settle into him. Not hope as fantasy, but hope as discipline. The understanding that meaning was not found in escape or absolution, but in sustained, honest effort. Somewhere behind him, the shelter door opened softly, and he felt her presence before he saw her. She stood beside him, sharing the cold without comment. They did not speak. They did not need to. The ice shifted beneath the distance, the land breathing as it always had, indifferent and enduring. He knew then that whatever came next would not be simple, and that simplicity was no longer his measure of worth. He had met her eyes without fear once, and the land had answered not with mercy, but with responsibility. That, he understood now, was a form of grace earned slowly, one day at a time,